Thanks for joining me for the course Accessible Customer Service. I'm Mark, your instructor. Before we begin, let me tell you how you can get the most out of this e-learning journey on serving customers with disabilities. It's important to know that training, like the one we're about to start, is a legal requirement under the Accessibility Standards for Customer Service of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. The Act became law in 2005. Under the Act is a regulation known as Ontario Regulation 42907, Accessibility Standards for Customer Service, which became law in January 2008. This regulation is about making customer service accessible for people with disabilities. From now on, we'll call the regulation the Customer Service Standard, or just the Standard for short. Training is a key part to this innovative standard. The standard says that you must be trained on serving customers with disabilities if you deal with the public, deal with third parties, participate in developing customer service policies, practices, and procedures. This training must be done as soon as it is reasonable after starting a job or duties in a business or organization. You must receive updated training when there are any changes to policies, practices, and procedures that relate to customer service for people with disabilities. Let's start this journey with one of the main reasons you're taking this course, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005. We'll call it the Act for short. The Act is a provincial law that allows the government to develop specific standards of accessibility and to enforce them. The goal is to make Ontario accessible by 2025. The purpose of the Act is to develop, implement, and enforce standards in these areas: goods, services, facilities, accommodations, employment, and buildings, structures, and premises. These standards address barriers to people with disabilities in these areas. How are these standards developed? The standards are developed by committees that include people with disabilities, the provincial government, and representatives of various industries and sectors. People have an opportunity to review and comment on the standard before they're completed. The standards may be adopted as regulations under the Act. Take a minute to think about what this change is going to mean for you or for your business or organization. Can you imagine what an accessible Ontario might look like? Let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm a Franco-Ontarian who loves the outdoors. I've lived in Ottawa, Timmins, and Toronto, camped in Algonquin Park, enjoyed a swim in Lake Superior, and visited many beautiful places in Ontario. Think for a moment about where you travel, live, and work, and what these places might look like without barriers. When everyone has access to places, people, and experiences, we all benefit. In this case, we benefit from the contributions, involvement, and spending power of people with disabilities. Greater accessibility will help prepare Ontario for the future. Our population is aging, so the number of people with disabilities will increase. Some people see disabilities as the barrier to full involvement in life, but actually, it's the environment that presents barriers. For example, having stereotypes about people with disabilities is a major barrier. There are sometimes physical barriers in the environment. Sometimes certain systems and processes create barriers. These barriers can be based on certain ideas of what the human experience should be like. So, it is the environment that presents barriers for people with disabilities, not the disabilities. So, now we have a regulation on accessible customer service under the Act. What is it? What do you have to do? The Customer Service Standard is the first standard developed under the Act. Other standards are expected to cover transportation, information and communications, employment, and the built environment. The built environment refers to physical things like the inside and outside of buildings. Remember that the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is about setting standards in areas of living that pose major barriers to people with disabilities. The vision behind the Act is to achieve accessibility for Ontarians with disabilities by 2025. There are more standards to follow, and they'll go through public review before being finalized. The Customer Service Standard became law January 1, 2008. The standard applies to all people and organizations that are designated in the regulation, or provide goods or services to the public or other businesses and organizations, known as third parties, and have at least one employee in Ontario. To help make sure everyone will be ready to implement the standard, there are 2 different dates for compliance. Check the Resources section under Compliance for types of organizations and when they need to comply. The goal of the standard is for every business and organization to provide service that is accessible to customers with all types of disabilities. Sometimes I'll call the businesses and organizations that must comply with the standard providers for short. There are a number of legal requirements under the standard. To comply, businesses and organizations must set up policies, practices, and procedures on providing goods or services to people with disabilities. Make reasonable efforts to ensure that policies, practices, and procedures are consistent with the key principles of independence, dignity, integration, and equality of opportunity. Have a policy about the use of assistive devices by people with disabilities. Communicate with the person with a disability in a manner that takes into account his or her disability. Let people with disabilities bring their service animals onto the parts of the premises open to the public or third parties, except in some situations. Let people with disabilities bring their support persons with them when accessing goods or services. If your organization charges an admission fee, let people know ahead of time what, if any, admission will be charged for a support person. Let the public know when facilities or services that people with disabilities usually use to access their goods and services are temporarily not available. Ensure that your staff receive training on how to serve people with disabilities, including staff involved in developing customer service policies, practices, and procedures, and staff who are likely to interact with customers. Receive feedback and let people know how feedback will be responded to and what action will be taken on any complaints. Make the information about the feedback process readily available to the public. You can find the summary of requirements in the Resources section. There are 3 more things that designated public sector organizations and providers with 20 or more employees must do to comply. You can check the Decision Makers section for an explanation on those additional requirements. Let's get to the essence of this course: interacting and serving customers with disabilities. You can read and download tip sheets on interacting with people with various disabilities. You may want to keep copies of these tip sheets handy and have them nearby as reminders. Let's review some scenarios and some suggested ways to interact with people with various disabilities, people using assistive devices, service animals, and support persons. Get ready. This is where you can really learn tips, suggestions, and ways to serve customers with disabilities. For everyday customer service, this is the practical information that you'll want to remember.
I've never tried to define disability for myself. It's one of those things that you know about its existence. You see individuals that have challenges, but on a day-to-day basis, you don't really think about it as part of your life until it becomes part of your reality.
I like to put ability instead of disability. I like to say, okay, I'm disabled, but with lots of abilities.
All disabilities, people with disabilities, have challenges because they either have a physical or a mental function which isn't working just the way everybody else's works.
Do you know what a disability is? My impression of a disability is someone who may just need a bit more time or assistance.
In my view, a disability is an artificially created circumstance. I'm totally blind, and yet for most of the time, I'm not disabled. For example, when I'm sitting in a restaurant and somebody hands me a print menu, which is usually what I get, I instantly become disabled. Some restaurants now carry a Braille menu. I'm no longer disabled.
It's easy for me to go to school, to run up the stairs, to go down the hallway, to buy a coffee, all those little things. And for someone with a disability, it's so much more than that.
A disability is only a detour to where you want to get to.
And it doesn't necessarily mean somebody in a wheelchair. It could be intellectual, it could be vision, it could be hearing.
Invisible or visible, sensory, mobility, intellectual, or mental health. That would be my definition of disability.
We're not talking about disabilities. We're talking about people with disabilities. So it's the person we're talking about.
I actually have never stopped myself since my disability of not going to a store, women's clothing or a restaurant just because they have a step, because I feel that I want them to see me, how I had to get in there, because I obviously had to get help to just bump me up that one step.
The government has a vision of an accessible Ontario by 2025. There are examples already across this province of people moving to an accessible Ontario. So what makes a person's life inclusive?
Well, I've always known that the greatest barrier that people who are blind or others that are labeled as disabled face is not the physical inability, it's the attitude and perception of individuals, others, and society, but perhaps equally as important, the attitude and perception that we have of ourselves.
My life changed in an instant. I was injured in a motor vehicle accident 17 years ago. And I think all my family and friends just did not know how to approach me actually and how to sort of handle it. And I think that what I found is that I was the one that was able to make them feel comfortable around me by sort of talking about myself.
So to make an accessible world for people, we have to start looking at communication.
I think it's usually the first few seconds is what it will take for the two people to be comfortable with each other. And then it's great from there.
A lot of people feel that because I'm visually impaired that I can read Braille. And I don't read Braille. I need somebody to read the menu for me. And I would like them to ask me what I would like. I don't want them to ask somebody sitting next to me because I know what I like and what I don't like.
A lot of people have this notion that since you can't see, it really doesn't matter if you have dark brown shoes or black shoes.
Often, when we take down a barrier for one person or help to take down a barrier for one person, we put up a barrier for another. Many times you'll hear people say, well, he's blind, but he may not be blind. He may be a person with a visual impairment. He has different needs. People who are deaf have different needs than people who have hearing impairments.
It's kind of absurd how little we know about people with disabilities in comparison to the rest of the cultures and the rest of the different groups of people that we live amongst.
The first thing you have to do is look at yourself. That's where education starts. Government can tell you, other people can tell you, books can tell you. But until you sort of look at yourself and look at someone you know who has a disability, that's how you educate yourself.
If a person doesn't understand the disability, then they don't know maybe how to socially interact with the person with the disability.
All Ontarians believe in accessibility and they believe it's the right thing to do. Accessibility is about social inclusion. For the world to be accessible, everybody has to be able to participate.
A fully accessible society is important for everyone. It will allow many of us to enjoy a quality of life that most others take for granted.
It's about you and I and people who have disabilities being able to do the same things. As a business, First of all, you have to have policies and practices in place that recognize that you're taking accessibility serious and that you're participating in breaking down barriers for people. It means that you have to make your staff aware and that your staff have to be trained in how to serve people with disabilities and to have an awareness of what of various disabilities.
There's so many different aspects in running a retail store, and I think the first and most important aspect is customer service. And so it starts with myself, being the owner of the store, that when I'm on the retail floor, that I ask customers how they're doing and if they're finding everything they need. And it's important that our managers do the same thing and our floor staff do the same thing. So it carries right through the whole organization.
Our designers wanted to hear firsthand from the customer. They wanted to understand, what does it really take to make an exhibit more accessible for someone who's blind or someone who's deaf or a person who has autism, for example.
Right.
So we put together a committee of 10 people, and all of these different disabilities are represented.
I think a lot of people with disabilities want to feel independent and want to shop in a store that treats them like everyone else.
I mean, we try not to treat the person differently. We certainly have to treat your situation differently and make sure that we can accommodate you.
The accessibility in a store will influence a lot my family directly.
It's the utmost importance to have complete accessibility, and it goes along with independence.
Mais un bon service à la clientèle, ça c'est de l'or, ça c'est précieux. Et ça va tellement avoir un grand impact sur moi que je vais retourner à ce magasin-là, mais sans aucun problème, j'y serai fidèle.
I believe that somebody that's providing customer service needs to ask the right questions. They need to ask questions. They can't make assumptions, and they have to be an active listener.
And if each person reaches out and does one little thing, we're saying customer service here. I don't like customer service. I like to say people helping people.
Astra, how can I help you as a retail owner?
Good service, friendly conversation keeps me coming back to the same store.
Persons with disabilities spend annually in Canada $25 billion. So it only makes sense that if you're in business, that you look towards that sector to improve your business opportunities.
And what does it end up costing me? I'll tell you, nothing. Very, very minimal. And what do I get in return? In the last 3 or 4 years, we've built 6 homes with varying degrees of accessible features in them. 6 sales that I would never have gotten if I hadn't even reached out and tried to make those accommodations.
So it's about incremental steps, and it's about small changes.
How can I help? Those are 4 great words. I had to count them up. How can I help? 4 great words, because they apply to anything.
That's a very warm and engaging thing to say to someone with a disability. How can I help you?
Often we're afraid to ask because we think we're going to offend, but sometimes the easiest way to learn is to actually ask the person about themselves and how can I help you to participate with me in whatever we're doing.
We all have to help each other.
By saying,
how can I help?
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 Here are some things to keep in mind when serving customers with disabilities. If you're not sure what to do, ask your customer, "May I help you?" Your customers with disabilities know if they need help and how you can provide it. Speak directly to your customer. Not everybody with the same disability experiences the same things. Don't make assumptions about the types of disability a person has. Your customers are not required to tell you about their disabilities. Take the time to get to know your customers' needs and focus on meeting those needs just like you would with any other customer. Some disabilities are not visible. All customers have a range of needs and preferences, and so do your customers with disabilities. If you can't understand what your customer is saying, politely ask him or her to repeat it. You may want to ask if the information you're conveying needs to be repeated. Ask, "Do you understand this?" Exercise patience. Now, let's take a look at additional suggestions and good practices on how to serve people with different types of disabilities. To make this easier for you, the disabilities are listed in alphabetical order. Don't forget to check out the word list in the resources section. It will help you use the right words. People who experience hearing loss may be deaf, oral deaf, deafened, or hard of hearing. People experiencing hearing loss may use assistive devices, like hearing aids, special telephones, sign language interpreters, various amplifiers, or a pen and paper. Here are suggested ways to serve customers with hearing loss. Attract the customer's attention before speaking. For example, try a gentle touch on the shoulder or wave of your hand. Don't shout. Make sure you're in a well-lit area where your customer can see your face. If the person uses a hearing aid, reduce background noise or move to a quieter area. A person who is deafblind cannot see or hear to some degree. Many people who are deafblind will be accompanied by an intervener, a professional who helps with communicating. Interveners are trained in special sign language that involves touching the hands of the client in a two-hand manual alphabet or finger spelling. Keep these suggestions in mind when you serve a customer who is deafblind. Speak directly to your customer, not to the intervener. Identify yourself to the intervener when you approach your customer who is deafblind. A customer who is deafblind is likely to explain to you how to communicate with them or give you an assistance card or a note explaining how to communicate with them. Developmental or intellectual disabilities can mildly or profoundly limit a person's ability to learn, communicate, do everyday physical activities, and live independently. You may not be able to know that someone has this disability unless you are told, or you notice the way the person acts, asks questions, or uses body language. However, they may understand you more than you realize. An example of a developmental disability would be Down syndrome. Here's some guidance. Don't assume what a person can or cannot do. Use plain language. Make sure your customer understands what you've said. You can be direct and ask, "Do you understand this?" Provide one piece of information at a time. You can break down the information into simpler concepts without exaggerating speech or gestures or being patronizing. You may want to ask if the information needs to be repeated. Let's talk about learning disabilities. This refers to a variety of disorders that affect how a person acquires, retains, or takes in information. People with learning disabilities just learn differently. Learning disabilities affect people from all backgrounds and are not caused by culture, language, or a lack of motivation. Learning disabilities are specific impairments that can result in problems with reading and language-based learning, or dyslexia, problems with mathematics, dyscalculia, or problems with writing and fine motor skills, dysgraphia. This disability may become apparent in your customer service interaction when the person has difficulty reading material or taking in and processing the information you're providing. Some tips. Take some time. People with some learning disabilities may take a little longer to process, understand, and respond. Provide information in a way that works for your customer. For example, keep a pen and paper handy. That way you can explain and then review and repeat the information using your notes. If you're discussing confidential information, consider giving the notes to your customer or offering to destroy them. Be prepared to explain any materials you provide for your customers. Mental health. The important thing to remember, focus on completing the transaction in a calm, patient way and meeting the customer's needs. Mental health issues can affect a person's ability to think clearly, concentrate, or remember. Mental health disability is a broad classification for many disorders that can range in severity. Customers may experience anxiety due to phobias or panic disorder. Hallucinations, mood swings, and a deep lack of motivation may be signs of a mental health disability. A person may have a clinical depression or bipolar disorder. The major barrier for people with mental health disabilities is the stigma associated with it and the lack of understanding. Here are some suggestions. Be confident and reassuring. As with all customers, listen carefully and focus on meeting the customer's needs. If the person appears to be in a crisis, ask them to tell you the best way to help. If a customer appears to show signs of a mental health disability, it may be helpful to keep in mind that the customer's reactions are not connected to you personally as a service provider. The customer may simply be showing symptoms of mental illness. Did you know that 1 in 5 people in Ontario will experience a mental health issue at some point in their lives? The common image of someone with a physical disability who uses a wheelchair is a stereotype. For example, physical disabilities can result from arthritis, heart or lung conditions, or amputations. Here are some tips, and there's more in the resources section. People with physical disabilities often have their own ways of doing things, so it's a good idea to ask before you help. Respect your customer's personal space. Don't lean over them or on an assistive device. Don't move items or equipment, such as canes or walkers, out of the person's reach. If you have permission to move a person in a wheelchair, remember to make sure your customer is ready to be moved and that you describe what you're going to do beforehand. Don't leave the individual in an awkward, dangerous, or undignified position, such as facing a wall or in the path of opening doors. In some situations, you can inform your customers of the accessible features in the immediate environment: automatic doors, accessible washrooms, elevators, ramps, etc. Okay, I know you're getting this. Look around you and check for things that may be in the way of someone with limited mobility. It's a good idea to remove them or find alternative ways to serve your customer. Some customers may have problems communicating because of their disability. Cerebral palsy, stuttering, hearing loss, or other conditions may make it difficult for the person to pronounce words or may cause slurring or stuttering. A person with this type of disability may use a communication board or other assistive devices. A few pointers. Don't assume that just because a person has this disability, they also have another. Give your customer whatever time they need to get their point across. If appropriate, offer to move to a more comfortable location. Ask questions that can be answered yes or no, if possible. Don't interrupt or finish your customer's sentences. Give them time to finish. Did you know that few people who are blind have no vision? According to CNIB, 9 out of 10 people who come to CNIB have some degree of vision. 3 million Canadians have difficulty reading conventional text. Vision loss can restrict someone's ability to read signs, locate landmarks, or see hazards. Some customers may use a guide dog or white cane. Others may not. Some customers simply need to view written materials like documents, receipts, menus, brochures, instructions, or labels in large print or with the help of a magnifier. Keep in mind, don't assume the individual can't see you. Identify yourself when you approach your customer and speak directly to him or her. Offer your elbow to guide the person. If they accept, walk slowly, but wait for permission before doing so. Identify landmarks or other details to orient your customer to the environment around them. If you're giving directions or providing any information, be precise and descriptive. For example, if you're approaching a door or an obstacle, say so. Don't leave your customer in the middle of a room. Guide them to a chair or a comfortable location. Don't walk away without saying goodbye. You've probably seen someone with vision loss who uses a guide dog. There are other types of service animals who help people with other disabilities as well. Hearing alert animals help people who are deaf, oral deaf, deafened, or hard of hearing. Animals trained to alert an individual to an oncoming seizure. Service animals trained to assist people with autism, mental health disabilities, physical disabilities, and other disabilities. You might recognize service animals when they wear a harness or a sign, or when they're helping someone. Their owner might carry a certificate or a letter from a doctor or nurse that states that the individual requires the use of a service animal because of a disability. You can ask to see such a letter. You might also observe the animal helping someone by opening doors or alerting them to certain sounds. The customer is responsible for the care and supervision of the service animal. Avoid touching, talking to, or making eye contact with the service animal. They are working animals and need to stay focused. Some people with disabilities that you encounter will be accompanied by a support person. A support person can be a personal support worker, a volunteer, a family member, or a friend of the person with a disability. A support person might help your customer with a variety of things, from communicating to helping with mobility, personal care, or medical needs. According to the regulation, support persons must be allowed to accompany an individual with a disability to any part of your organization that is open to the public or to third parties. A customer with a disability might not introduce their support person. If you're not sure which person is the customer, you could take your lead from the person using or requesting your goods or services, or simply ask. Once you've determined who your customer is, then speak directly to him or her, not to the support person. It's also good practice to confirm with your client or customer that they want the support person to be present while confidential matters are being discussed. Let's talk about assistive devices. Most assistive devices used by people with disabilities are personal assistive devices, such as wheelchairs. They belong to the person using them, and they are part of that person's personal space. So, it's generally inappropriate to lean on or reach over them. Also, it wouldn't be good practice to restrict anyone from moving around by holding on to the person's personal assistive device. There are many assistive devices that you won't even notice at first glance, such as a hearing aid, and some aren't used all the time, like a speech amplification device or a white cane. Let's consider for a moment the assistive devices in your operation that may help with the provision of goods or services to customers with disabilities. The standard says that you must be trained on how to use them. Ideally, you should have instruction manuals handy, perhaps a summary instruction sheet. One of the more common assistive devices is a TTY line. TTY stands for teletypewriter, a type of telephone that allows callers to send typed messages to each other across phone lines. TTY users can directly call other TTY numbers, or they can connect with a relay service. A standard phone user can also place a call to a TTY user through the relay operator. You give the operator your name, the name of the person you're calling, and the number you wish to reach. Using the relay service locally is free. For long distance, any standard long-distance charges would apply. A handy how-to for both TTY and relay system calls is provided in the Resources section. Examples of other assistive devices that can help you serve your customers would be alternative keyboards for people who have difficulty with conventional ones. Or you might have software that enables people with disabilities to communicate with you using a computer. Elevators, escalators, and automatic door openers are assistive devices. Under the standard, you must provide notification when these services are temporarily not available. Sometimes your customers will have difficulty accessing your services. Most customers have specific needs or preferences. Being positive, flexible, and open to suggestions will help to create a good customer experience. If you notice that your customer is having difficulty accessing your services, a good starting point is to ask how you can best help them. Often, there are simple solutions. For example, your customer is deaf and doesn't have a sign language interpreter. You could ask him in writing if using a pen and paper would be a good way to serve him or her. Remember, if you're discussing confidential information, offer to return the notes to the customer or to destroy them. Perhaps your customer can't reach some of the products in your shop because the displays and counters are too high. You could offer to bring the products to him or her. If the menu in your restaurant is unreadable to someone with vision loss, you could offer to read the menu aloud. Be prepared to help with doors if your business doesn't have automatic door openers. It's time to pull all this information and learning together. In the last half hour or so, you've learned about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005 and the vision behind it for making Ontario accessible by 2025. The Customer Service Standard, deadlines for compliance, and what's required to comply. The standard's specific customer service requirements. Tips on interacting with people with various disabilities. Interacting with people who have service animals, support persons, assistive devices, and what to do if a customer with a disability is having difficulty accessing your services. If there are any areas that you need to repeat, take the time now to review and download and print any material for future reference. Take the time to ask yourself, what have I learned about serving customers with disabilities? What will I do differently from now on? Thank you for letting me share this information with you. Enjoy your day.